The card that changed everything. My granddaughter Emily thought nobody would find out about the $1,000 she spent from my bank card. She was wrong. Every purchase came to my phone as a notification. Every $50 ATM withdrawal, every restaurant dinner, every new blouse. I saw it all. And Emily had no idea what price she'd have to pay for that money. My name is Rose Mitchell. I'm 82 years old, and I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4 with liver metastases. The doctors give me 3 to 8 months, maybe a year with aggressive chemotherapy. But at my age and with this diagnosis, even the best treatment only prolongs the agony slightly. But before I die, I need to fulfill my late husband Frank's final wish. He wanted me to test our grandchildren. Frank always said that money is the litmus test of the human soul, and that true character only shows when a person thinks nobody's watching. Our story began long before the grandchildren were born. In 1987, Frank's uncle, an old bachelor named Albert Mitchell, suddenly died of a heart attack. He was 73, had worked his whole life as a railroad mechanic, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Albert was never married, had no children. Frank was his only nephew, and while they kept in touch, they rarely saw each other. Uncle Albert always seemed strange to us. He saved every penny, wore the same shirt for years, drove a 30-year-old car. After the funeral, Frank and I went to sort through his belongings. The house was packed with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, jars of nails and screws, the typical home of an old bachelor who never threw anything away. The will was simple, handwritten on a sheet from a school notebook. Uncle Albert left Frank everything: the house, the old car, and a plot of land in the Houston suburbs. The house was worth maybe $15,000. The car, nothing at all. But the land... We went to look at it a week after the funeral. 40 acres of brush-covered wasteland, half an hour from the city. No buildings, no roads, just thorny bushes and Texas heat. The land looked completely useless. Frank stood in the middle of this desert, wiping sweat from his forehead and shaking his head, wondering what Uncle Albert had planned to do with it. Later we learned that Uncle had bought this plot in 1960 for $3,000. He'd spent almost all his savings on land that brought no income. Just taxes every year, about $500. The real estate agent we consulted was categorical in his opinion. We needed to sell immediately. According to him, they'd give us $8,000 maximum for this land, and that's if we were lucky. And in 5 years, it would be worth even less. Frank's relatives said the same thing. His younger brother, Tommy, constantly mocked the decision, claiming that Uncle Albert had always been eccentric and wasted his whole life on useless land. He advised selling quickly before anyone else was willing to buy. But Frank was a stubborn man. He went to the city administration, studied development plans, talked to highway department engineers, and he learned something interesting. They planned to build a new highway through this land that would connect the suburbs to downtown. The project was under discussion, but the prospects looked promising. Frank decided to wait 5 years and see what would happen. 5 years turned into 10. Highway plans were postponed due to budget problems. Relatives continued calling us fools for not selling the land immediately. Even I sometimes doubted Frank's decision. In 1995, highway construction began. In 1998, it opened. Our plot ended up a few miles from the new highway, and its value began to rise. In 2002, a major development company started buying land in our area to build a shopping center. They offered us $40,000 for the plot. Frank refused, thinking it was still too early to sell. In 2005, they offered $80,000. Frank refused again, deciding to wait a little longer. In 2007, shopping center construction began, and we were offered $200,000. In 2010, the shopping center opened, and our plot was right in the center of a developing commercial district. The state's largest supermarket chain wanted to build their flagship store right on our land. They offered $2,300,000. This time, Frank agreed. The plot that Uncle Albert bought for $3,000 in 1960 brought us a fortune 50 years later. But Frank didn't spend this money on luxury. He studied the investment market as carefully as he once studied city development plans. He bought stocks in growing tech companies when they were still trading for pennies. He invested in real estate in developing areas of Austin and Dallas. By 2015, when Frank died, our capital exceeded $3 million. But in Frank's final months, he became obsessed with a strange idea. Lying in his hospital bed, he talked for hours about our grandchildren, about how they'd grown up in comfort and didn't understand the value of money, about how easy money corrupts character. A week before his death, he asked me to promise that I would test them before leaving the inheritance. In his opinion, they had to prove they deserved this money. I thought this was the rambling of a dying man. Our grandchildren are good kids. Yes, they have flaws, but who's perfect? Sarah, the eldest granddaughter, had always been an example to the others. Excellent grades in school, prestigious college, successful marriage to a doctor, raising 2 children, managing the household, helping at her husband's clinic. Michael worked as an analyst at a major financial company. Smart, ambitious, earned good money. Recently bought a house, planned to marry a colleague. Rachel was a caring mother of 3 children. Her husband worked in construction. The family lived modestly, but happily. Rachel never complained about difficulties. Even Jason and Emily, despite their problems, didn't seem hopeless to me. Jason was just young and stupid. Many men go through such phases. Emily spent more than she earned. But what young person doesn't make such mistakes? Before his death, Frank added a special condition to the will. The grandchildren had to pass a test of honesty. If they failed, all inheritance would go to a charity fund named after Uncle Albert. After Frank's funeral, I spent 6 months thinking about his final wish. I read the will again and again, trying to understand what he meant. Gradually, I began noticing things I'd previously ignored. Jason came to visit more and more often and always asked for money. For car repairs, apartment rent, or just until payday. He never returned the money, and his requests became increasingly insistent. Once a neighbor mentioned she'd seen him at an underground casino in Chinatown. At first, I didn't believe it, but then I started paying attention to details. Jason often looked agitated, checked his phone every few minutes, got strange calls at any time of day or night. Emily lived beyond her means. This was obvious to anyone who knew her salary. An apartment in a prestigious Austin neighborhood cost over $1,500 a month. A car, a new Toyota Camry lease, designer clothes, expensive restaurants, vacations in Europe. With a salary of $50,000 a year, Such a lifestyle was impossible without credit, and I knew she had several credit cards with large debts. Even the other grandchildren had their weaknesses. Michael once let slip about how his colleagues used tax loopholes to hide clients' income. He talked about it as normal practice. Rachel spent her husband's money on things he didn't know about: expensive toys for the children, cosmetics, clothes. Small amounts, but systematically and without consultation. Even Sarah, despite all her outward perfection, had a habit of forgetting her wallet when we dined in restaurants. She always apologized and promised to pay back, but somehow never did. A year after Frank's death, I made my decision. I would conduct the test he had envisioned. I opened 5 identical debit cards at different banks so the grandchildren wouldn't find out about each other. I put $5,000 on each. I asked the bank to set up notifications on my phone for every transaction: date, time, amount, location. The plan was simple. Over 5 weeks, I would visit each grandchild and forget the card. I'd see what they would do when they thought nobody was watching. Sarah was first. I came to her Saturday morning under the pretext of helping with the children. We spent a wonderful weekend, cooking family dinner, playing with little Tommy and Emma, going through old family photos. Sarah seemed especially attentive those days. She hugged me often, said how glad she was to see I looked well after my recent illness. We talked about future plans, about how quickly children grow. Before leaving Sunday evening, I deliberately left the card on the kitchen table, next to my car keys. I placed it so Sarah would definitely notice when cleaning up after dinner. Sarah noticed the card when cleaning up after breakfast. She grabbed it and ran outside, but my car had already disappeared around the corner. She immediately called my cell phone and excitedly reported that she'd found my bank card on her table. She offered to come right away and bring it to me. I pretended I was already far away and asked her to keep the card until my next visit. A week passed in complete silence. No notifications from the bank. When I came to get the card, Sarah handed it to me with apologies for making me drive specially. The first test passed perfectly. Sarah didn't even check the balance. Michael was next. I spent the weekend with him, listening to stories about work at the financial company, about plans to buy a more spacious house for his future family. Michael was an educated and reasonable young man. He showed me his investment portfolios, explained strategies, shared future plans. I could see that money for him wasn't just a means of spending, but a tool for achieving goals. I left the card in his home office between books on financial planning, a place where he'd definitely find it during morning work preparation. Michael discovered the card Monday morning and immediately called me at work. He reported that he'd found my bank card in his office and asked if I'd lost it the day before. I confirmed that I'd been looking for the card. Michael honestly admitted he'd checked the balance out of curiosity and was surprised by the substantial amount. He expressed concern about the safety of keeping such money on a debit card and suggested transferring it to a savings account. Then he hesitantly asked to borrow $4,000 for roof repairs after the hurricane, promising to return it in 3 months with market rate interest. Michael could have simply taken money from the card, but instead asked permission. This showed his integrity. The second test passed. Rachel was third. My granddaughter always seemed the most caring of all. She was raising 3 children practically alone. Her husband worked construction from dawn to dusk, while she combined child rearing with part-time seamstress work. I came to her on Wednesday when the children were at school and daycare. We spent the day talking about family, plans, parenting difficulties. Rachel looked tired but happy. I left the card in the bathroom next to children's medicines, a place where Rachel was constantly bathing children and monitoring their health. 3 days passed quietly. I began thinking Rachel would act like Sarah and Michael. But Saturday evening, a transaction notification arrived. $200 at a 24-hour pharmacy. An hour later, the phone rang. Rachel's voice trembled with tears. Rachel confessed that she'd found my card 3 days ago and spent $200. She told me that her youngest daughter, Sophia, had developed a high fever in the middle of the night, and they had to go to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed serious strep throat with complications. Expensive imported antibiotics were needed that weren't covered by their cheap insurance. $200 was more than half the family's weekly income. Rachel explained that they had no money until her husband's payday, and Sophia's condition was worsening. She saw my card and panicked. Rachel cried, admitting her mistake, and promised to return every penny from the next paycheck. Maternal instinct versus honesty. Rachel chose her daughter, but conscience forced her to confess voluntarily. The third test counted with reservations, but counted. Jason was fourth on my list. By then, I had no illusions about my youngest grandson, but I wanted to give him a fair chance. Jason lived in a rental apartment in a not-so-good neighborhood. He worked for his uncle's construction company, but irregularly. Often took time off, skipped work without good reason. I spent Sunday with him, cooked dinner, tidied up the neglected apartment. Jason was distracted, often answered calls, going to another room. I left the card on the coffee table in the living room, next to the TV remote. Jason spent most of his time there, watching sports channels. He found the card that same evening. The first notification came 2 hours later. Cash withdrawal at an ATM, $500. The second at midnight. Another $300. The third at 1 in the morning, $200. By Monday morning, Jason had spent $1,000. The geography of transactions spoke for itself. Underground casino in Chinatown, bookmaker's office, gaming club. Within a week, he'd blown all $5,000. Bank statements showed the exact picture. Online poker, sports betting, casino roulette. Jason gambled everything away in 7 days and never called me once. When the card was empty, he simply threw it in the trash. I knew this because the last withdrawal attempt was declined by the ATM due to insufficient funds. The first complete failure. Emily remained last. My youngest granddaughter had always been closest to me. We often called each other, she shared plans, talked about work at the advertising agency. But in the past year, our relationship had become more strained. Emily often seemed anxious when money came up. She avoided conversations about the future, about plans with her boyfriend Mike. I came to her the last Sunday in October. We spent the day talking about family, about how Mike was increasingly talking about marriage and a shared home. Emily told me about future plans, about how Mike was increasingly talking about marriage and a shared home. But then she bitterly added that it was all so expensive. Wedding, apartment deposit, furniture. Sometimes it seemed they'd never save enough money. I saw the stress in her eyes. Emily was living the beautiful life she couldn't afford, and it was slowly destroying her. I left the card on the kitchen table, next to the coffee machine. Emily drank coffee every morning. She'd definitely noticed the card. The first 3 days passed in silence. I began hoping Emily would make the right choice. On the 4th day, the first notification arrived. Cash withdrawal at an ATM near her work, $50. A small amount, possibly an accident or extreme necessity. But then notifications started coming regularly. $50 at a gas station, $100 at a grocery store, $80 at a restaurant. Emily spent money carefully, in small amounts. Not like Jason, who blew everything at once in casinos. She bought everyday things, paid bills, dined with Mike, like someone who knows they're doing wrong but justifies themselves with necessity. By the end of the first week, she'd spent $250. By the end of the second, $400. By the end of the third, $700. By the end of the month, just over $4,000 remained on the card. Emily had spent almost $1,000 and never called me once. The last purchases were especially painful. New shoes for $150. Dinner at an expensive restaurant for $80. Cosmetics for $70. Emily was spending my money on luxuries she couldn't afford. The second complete failure. The month of observation ended. The test results were exactly what Frank had predicted. A month after the test began, I gathered all the grandchildren at my house. I told them I wanted to talk about the family's future. They sat in my living room, nervous and wary. Nobody knew what awaited them. I announced that a month ago, each of them had found my bank card at their house. And this was a special test. Each card had $5,000, and I wanted to see their reaction. I saw how some of them paled. Then I addressed Sarah and noted that she'd returned the card the next day without even checking the balance, which showed her honesty. I told Michael that he'd checked the balance out of caution, but immediately contacted me and asked to borrow money rather than simply taking it, which demonstrated his integrity. I explained to Rachel that she'd spent money only on her daughter's treatment and immediately confessed, which showed her as a good mother and honest person. I stood and approached the old secretary desk in the corner of the room. I took out a thick folder of documents. This folder contained my will and something else they didn't know about. I showed them bank statements, investment portfolios, real estate documents. Over 40 years, I'd accumulated $3,200,000. Money left to me by their grandfather and my own investments. The figure stunned them. They'd never imagined their grandmother had such capital. I announced that Sarah receives the house and $800,000, handing her an envelope. Michael receives $700,000. Rachel receives $600,000, plus an educational fund for the children worth $200,000. Sarah couldn't speak from shock. Michael sat with his mouth open. Rachel sobbed with happiness. Then I turned to Jason and Emily and told them the results of their tests. I told Jason he'd spent all $5,000 in a week, gambling it away in casinos, and hadn't even tried to contact me. I explained to Emily that she'd spent almost $1,000 over the month in small amounts, thinking I wouldn't notice. I announced that my voice became stricter because they'd both failed the test and shown that money was more important to them than honesty and family relationships. Jason tried to object, but I stopped him and declared the decision final. Each would receive $50,000 after my death, a symbolic amount so they wouldn't be left completely without means. Emily cried and tried to explain that she'd wanted to return the money. I interrupted her and said it was too late to talk about intentions since the test had shown her true nature. The remaining $1 million, according to grandfather's will, goes to charity. Sarah, Michael, and Rachel were stunned by the inheritance size. Jason simply got up and left, slamming the door. Emily stayed after the others left and tried to explain that she'd had financial problems with credits and work and hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. I answered that the test wasn't about financial problems, but about the choice she made when she thought nobody was watching. Emily left without saying another word. 3 months later, Emily appeared at my door, looking completely different, thinner, exhausted, with red, tear-filled eyes. She told me in a trembling voice that she needed to talk. I invited her in. Emily sat in the same chair where 3 months ago she'd learned about her lost inheritance. Her hands were shaking. Emily told me her mother was sick with stage 2 breast cancer. She explained that Catherine was truly a good woman who'd raised Emily after her husband's death, worked as a nurse at the city hospital, and never asked me for help. Emily continued that insurance only covered basic treatment, chemotherapy, and surgery, but doctors recommended new experimental therapy that increased recovery chances from 60 to 90%. She took medical documents from her bag and explained that this therapy cost $12,000, but insurance didn't cover it due to its experimental status. Emily looked at me with eyes full of despair and admitted she understood she had no right to ask since she'd failed my test and spent my money on foolishness. But she was asking for help not for herself, but for her mother. Emily added that her mother didn't know about her visit to me because she'd forbidden asking the family for money, saying they'd manage on their own. She offered to give up her $50,000 inheritance and asked if I could give it earlier or arrange a loan against this inheritance. Catherine was dear to me. She'd cared for my son until his death, raised Emily alone, worked at the hospital during the pandemic, risking her own health. She deserved help, but I'd given my word to Frank. The test had to have real consequences. I told Emily as gently as possible that I understood her pain, but she'd failed the test and shown that money was more important to her than honesty. For the first time in all these years, Emily raised her voice at me and shouted that her mother might die. I firmly replied that then she needed to find a way to help her mother herself. I explained that she'd receive $50,000 only after my death, as written in the will. Emily looked at me with such despair that my heart clenched, but I couldn't change my decision. Emily quietly asked if I was really ready to let my daughter-in-law die because of the $1,000 she'd spent. I answered that I was ready to let her bear responsibility for her actions. Emily stood up, wiped away tears, and headed for the door. She said without turning around that she'd find this money herself and would never ask me for another cent. The door slammed, and I was left alone with my principles. The following weeks became a real trial for me. My son called every day, telling me what was happening in their family. Emily quit the advertising agency and got 2 jobs simultaneously. During the day, she worked as a waitress in a busy downtown restaurant. Shifts lasted from 11 in the morning to 7 in the evening, 7 days a week. After the restaurant, she went to an office building where she worked as a cleaner from 9 at night to 3 in the morning. She slept 4 hours, woke up, went to the restaurant. She sold her Toyota Camry for $18,000 and bought the used Honda Civic for $3,000. The difference went toward the first payment for her mother's treatment. Emily broke her expensive apartment lease, paying a $2,000 penalty, and moved in with her mother, officially to help during treatment, actually to save $1,000 a month on rent. Catherine began treatment immediately. Cancer doesn't wait for families to save enough money. Each chemotherapy session cost $1,500, almost Emily's weekly salary from 2 jobs. Mike, Emily's boyfriend, couldn't handle this regime after just a month. He wanted a girlfriend he could go to restaurants with and plan a wedding, not a nurse who worked 20 hours a day. Mike explained to my son that he understood Emily's desire to help her mother, but she had no time left for their relationship, since they hadn't seen each other properly in 3 weeks. Emily didn't even cry when he left. She had no time for tears. Friends gradually disappeared from her life too. Who would invite to parties a girl who falls asleep on her feet and can only talk about work and hospitals? Emily's entire life focused on 2 things: earning money and caring for her mother. I watched her from afar. I saw how she lost weight from exhaustion and stress, how her former carefree nature disappeared, how she transformed from a frivolous girl into a responsible woman, working 16 hours a day and caring for her sick mother at night. Mike couldn't handle the regime and left her after a month. Friends stopped inviting her to parties. She had no time. Her entire life concentrated on 2 things: work and her mother. Catherine began chemotherapy with money Emily earned. Each session cost $1,500, almost a week's salary from 2 jobs. Emily worked like crazy to pay for each treatment. I saw them at the hospital during one of my doctor visits. Emily slept on an uncomfortable plastic chair next to her mother's bed. Clutching her waitress uniform, she had to run to her evening shift straight from the oncology ward. Her hands were red from cleaning chemicals she used in the office building, eyes inflamed from constant sleep deprivation, face gaunt from stress and exhaustion. But she didn't give up. Catherine underwent chemotherapy twice a week. After each session, she felt worse: nausea, weakness, hair loss. Emily took time off from the restaurant to drive her mother to the hospital and stay with her. Lost shifts meant less money. Less money meant treatment would have to be stretched out. And you can't stretch out cancer treatment. Emily started taking extra shifts on weekends when the office building wasn't operating. She washed windows in private homes, cleaned up after parties, worked catering events. Sometimes she worked 22 hours a day, slept 2 hours, and went back to work. After 3 months of this regime, Emily had earned $11,000. Almost the entire amount went to chemotherapy and related medications. Another $1,000 was needed for the final stage of treatment, surgery to remove the tumor. That's when something happened that changed my opinion of my granddaughter. My son told me that Emily asked him to lend her the last $1,000. David agreed, but offered to simply give the money as a gift. He saw how his sister was killing herself with work. Emily refused. Mike offered to simply gift the money, seeing how his sister was killing herself with work. But Emily refused. She insisted on taking only a loan and wrote an IOU for $1,000 with an obligation to return the money within 6 months. The surgery was successful. Doctors removed the tumor completely. No metastases were found. Catherine was saved, and Emily continued working 2 jobs to pay back her brother's loan. 6 months after our last conversation, she'd paid off all debts. 8 months later, she'd saved enough money to rent a small apartment near her mother. A year later, Catherine was completely healthy. Tests showed no cancer cells. Doctors spoke of stable remission. And Emily had transformed into a completely different person. Work had changed her, not just outwardly, but inwardly. Her former frivolity disappeared, replaced by determination and willpower. She learned to value every dollar, plan budgets, live within her means. But most importantly, she learned to sacrifice for those she loves. That's when I realized I'd made a mistake. Frake's test showed which grandchildren were weak against temptation, but it didn't show who was capable of change, who could turn their weakness into strength. Emily had failed the honesty test, but passed a more important trial, the ability to love and sacrifice. I began watching her more carefully. I learned she'd gotten a permanent job as a customer service manager at a medical company. The salary was modest, but stable. Emily no longer lived beyond her means. She rented a small apartment, drove the old Honda, bought clothes at regular stores, but she looked happier than she once did in expensive dresses. Every weekend, she came to her mother, helped with housework, prepared food for the week. Their relationship became closer than ever. Emily wasn't dating anyone. At work, she was often invited on dates, but she refused. She said she wasn't ready for serious relationships yet. Actually, as I understood later, she was afraid of becoming that frivolous girl again who spends money on luxury. 18 months after announcing the will, I made a decision. I needed to correct my mistake before it was too late. My health was deteriorating rapidly. Doctors revised the prognosis for the worse. Now we were talking about several months of life. The diagnosis proved more aggressive than initially assumed. I called Emily and asked her to come. When she entered my house, I saw a completely different woman. Work and trials had hardened her character. There was no longer the former confusion in her eyes, only calm confidence. I asked her to sit and said I needed to tell her something. Emily sat on the edge of the chair, tensely waiting. I began by saying how proud I was of her, what she'd done for her mother, and who she'd become. Emily was silent, but I saw surprise in her eyes. Then I apologized to her. I explained that my test was correct in form, but wrong in essence, since I was testing honesty when I should have tested love. I took a new envelope from the secretary and announced that this was a changed will, according to which she receives the same share of inheritance as Sarah, Michael, and Rachel, $800,000. Emily shook her head and quietly said she didn't want my money, since the lesson I'd taught her was worth more than any money. I replied that this was exactly why she deserved it, and asked her to take the money not as a reward, but as a tool for good deeds. Emily took the envelope with trembling hands. I asked what she planned to do with it. Emily answered without hesitation that she'd open a fund to help families of cancer patients, so others wouldn't have to choose between working 3 shifts and caring for loved ones. At that moment, I realized Emily had become better than all of us. Now, lying in my hospice bed, I think about how our family has changed over these 2 years. Sarah used her inheritance to open a charitable clinic in a poor part of town. She provides free medical care to those without insurance. Michael created a financial planning consultation service for young families. He helps people avoid debt traps and live within their means. Rachel finished child psychology courses and now works with troubled teenagers in social centers. Jason also changed, though more slowly than the others. He underwent treatment for gambling addiction, got a steady job, began regularly attending support groups. I left him $100,000 in the will, less than the others, but enough for a new start. And Emily, her fund helped 80 families pay for cancer treatment in a year of operation. She married an oncologist named Daniel, who works with her organization. They plan to dedicate their lives to fighting cancer. Last week, Emily gave birth to a daughter and named her Rose after me. When she brought the baby to show me, I saw in her eyes that love which once made her work 20 hours a day to save her mother. Emily thanked me for the most important lesson of her life. I asked what lesson she meant. Emily answered that true love is measured not by words, but by actions. Tomorrow I'll sign the final will. Emily will receive her full share, plus additional funds for developing the fund. And the day after tomorrow, if I live another day, I'll tell all the grandchildren the last family story about how Uncle Albert saved every penny his whole life, not out of greed, but out of love for a nephew he barely knew. About how Frank waited 30 years for the right moment, not out of stubbornness, but out of wisdom. And about how sometimes the cruelest trials lead to the most important discoveries. My test is finished. The family is saved. And that's the best inheritance I can leave.